Unit 3, essay question number 4. So we're going to talk about capillary exchange, and we'll talk about it in terms of this being the arterial side and this being the venous side, marked by the red arteries and the blue veins. So in both sides, they contain the same things. They have a hydrostatic pressure, which is the pressure that's maintained by vasoconstriction and dilation within the artery and or vein, that's maintained by that here, and that's maintained by pressure gradients here. But we will break it down in terms of what the net values are. So if we talk about hydrostatic pressure, we will see it as a opportunity for the for things to move out at 30. This is all in terms of, so hydrostatic pressure is 30 out. ICOP, which is the interstitial colloid osmotic pressure, and then BCOP is it's the blood colloid osmotic pressure. So ICOP, let me go back to that. ICOP is 8. The IFP is the pressure that this vessel right here, which is a lymphatic vessel, is actually pulling things out of the blood. And so it actually has a negative value, but we don't usually typically write it as negative just for the sake of math. But that negative value means that has like suction power. It's pulling things out of the blood. And so that is it's moving things out at 3 millimeters of mercury. And then BCOP is moving things out, at 28. So if you do this quick math, you'll get 41 minus 28, which is equal to 13 millimeters of mercury out. So on the arterial side, when they reach the exchange at the capillary, there's 13 millimeters of mercury of pressure moving things out of the arteries. And then if we switch over to this venous side, COP, and we find that everything is the same for ICOP, for IFP, and for BCOP, but the hydrostatic pressure in a vein is much lower at 10. And that is because it has no structure. It's weak, and there's muscle in an artery that holds it, and they can withstand much more pressure. But when we do this math, we get 21 out and 28 in, so we get a negative 7 millimeters of mercury, which means that there are things moving into the vein, which makes sense because in an artery things are moving out because the heart is pushing it out to the body, and then it's being put into the body from there, and everything in the veins is returning back to the heart. And so we're having things go back into the blood in the veins to be moved back to the heart and back into the vitals of the body. But that's the basics of the capillary exchange, and it's important to note that the same thing is here. There still is a lymphatic vessel pulling things out of the vein, even though it's already doing that on the arterial side. It doesn't change. It still has 3 moving out, but that is how the capillary exchange works. And when something becomes inflamed, we sometimes call that swelling, edema in the body, and we'll talk about how that is affected by capillary exchange. So the first thing is right-sided heart failure. When right-sided heart failure occurs, the venous return to the body, I'd probably be going that way. The venous return to the body would be poor back to the heart, and so you would have an increase of blood being built up in here, you wouldn't get a good of a return. And because of that, you would not be able to be pulling as much away using IFP, or ICOP wouldn't be able to do as much. And this hydrostatic pressure would greatly be affected because stuff would start to leach back out into the body instead of being taken in and out from the surrounding tissues. Another cause can be histamines. Histamines create gaps in this here. It makes leaky vessels. So as the vein is trying to uptake fluid and send it back to the heart, it will come in and it's leaky and it will come back out, and it causes a swelling and an inflammation in the body. It's often why you take an antihistamine when you have allergies, because it helps to close up those leaky, the pores in the vessels. And then the last thing we'll talk about is liver. So if your liver doesn't have great function, then as this is going in and being sent to the liver will have it build up and it's being pushed back. And so the same thing that caused by the right-sided heart failure, it will start to leak back out into the body, and this will cause swelling and inflammation in the body, kind of the same way as that. So here we have a heart, the aortic arch, then it's moving up, and this is the carotid sinus here. So we have something in our bodies called the baroreflex, and that reflex, the baroreceptor reflex, that reflex helps us to maintain heart rate up or down to keep a homeostatic level of blood, especially in our brain when we stand up and feel lightheaded or dizziness. So these baroreceptors here are on this carotid sinus, and there's also some on the aortic arch here. But what they do in response to reflex is when they are stretched out or their stretch is relaxed, then they send a signal to the heart to beat faster or slower based on that response. When blood pressure suddenly drops, these receptors here are relaxed and they don't stretch at all. So it sends a signal down and into the heart to increase your heart rate. And this is because that stretch has gone away. And so it knows that there's not blood no longer is reaching up into the brain. So when we increase the heart rate, it will slow down the parasympathetic response and it will increase the sympathetic response in the heart here. And that will start sending blood up into the brain, and it will stretch these receptors here again until they are sufficiently stretched and maintained to keep that same blood pressure. And the opposite would happen if your stress and your heart rate is increased, then these are going to start really stretching out. And you can actually do a carotid massage, which will really stretch these out, and it will start to decrease your heart rate here because it will increase the parasympathetic response to slow your heart rate down. But those baroreceptors are a very good tool to use as a medical professional. The last thing that I'd like to discuss is the myogenic versus the paracrine response to vasoconstriction and dilation. So the myogenic response is a more generalized response, and I just have them written here. So this is the myogenic response, and it follows this cascade where when the vessel is stretched, the muscle will contract in response to that, which then is a constriction. These two are basically the same thing. And because it constricts that vessel, it will cause an increase to that blood pressure. And that's just generalized for everywhere. And then this paracrine reaction is when you need a more specific thing to happen. It's usually because I wrote here because of an occlusion to the blood vessel, such as like a plaque buildup or an embolism of some kind. But what it does is it will increase your metabolic pathway, which will increase the nitric oxide here. That nitric oxide will lower your oxygen levels and raise your CO2 levels, which are not good. And so it will dilate your blood vessel instead of constricting it to help increase the blood flow around that occlusion. And then there's these two subcategories that when you increase the blood flow in response to a metabolic activity, to an increase in metabolic activity, it is known as active hyperemia. And then if you restore blood flow to a dilated artery, that is known as reactive hyperemia. But that is the last two things about vasoconstriction and dilation.